here's the thing about telling people, like calorie counting obviously is going to work. You need to be at a calorie deficit to lose weight. Like I'm not refuting the calories in, calories out model of obesity, right? But telling somebody that their weight ultimately comes down to the amount of calories they're consuming is just like saying, if you came to me and you were like, Max, how do I get rich? It's like, it's the equivalent of saying, earn more than you spend. That's it. But it doesn't tell a person anything about how to save money, how to make money, anything like that. It's just very poor advice. So what I offer in the book is sort of like how to get rich and how to make more money and how to save more money without really having to become obsessed and let it rule your life. So I'm glad you brought up hyperpalatable foods. I think this is a huge topic. I liken it to mouth porn. Essentially, you're seeing a lot of people who are actually becoming addicted to pornography today due to the fact that it's just ever present on the internet and super accessible. The same thing could be said for ultra-processed convenience foods. They're always at arm's length today. And this is one of the reasons why your average person is eating for 16 hours over the course of the day. From the minute they wake up in the morning to just before they go to sleep, they are consuming and metabolizing food. So the proximity issue is one thing. And the other issue, which we now know thanks to data, which wasn't even, available to us when I had written my first book, that ultra-processed foods cause you to overeat them. We know, thanks to a study at the National Institutes of Health, that when you base your diet around ultra-processed foods, which I'm not just speaking in abstract, like this is 60% of the calories that most people consume today come from ultra-processed foods, that it becomes exponentially more difficult to control your hunger. And this is to a pretty profound degree. People actually will end up over-consuming about 500 additional calories every day. When they base their diets around these ultra-processed foods. And conversely, if you stick to primarily whole foods, your hunger self-regulates and you actually come in at a calorie deficit effortlessly. And in that study, both on the ultra-processed foods diet and the whole foods diet, the subjects were eating to satiety. Yeah. So they were eating to fullness. They were eating until the point at which they were like, all right, I've had enough.
Incredible. One of the things that you talk about is that the process of digestion itself burns calories. It's one of the things that we really don't think about in the context of eating foods. So how does that compare if we're eating a processed food? Maybe it's just, I don't know why this is jumping in my mind, but Funyuns.
Yeah.
A bag of Funyuns versus a bag of raw almonds.
Yeah, man. That's why I love talking to you, because you ask all the best questions. I was hoping that I would get to bring this up because this is another new study. Digestion is crucially important, obviously, to assimilate and absorb nutrients from our food. But it also, how we digest these foods dictates to a large degree the amount of energy that we're absorbing from them. And when you're eating ultra-processed foods, like Funyuns, like ice cream, like commercially produced breads, you can be certain that you are absorbing 100% of the calories that you consume. When you're eating whole foods, a significant portion of the calories that you might even read on the serving size of the nutrition facts label, a significant portion of those calories are actually not even getting digested. They're passing through you. This was recently revealed in a USDA study where they looked at whole nuts, and they found that a significant, like almost 30% of the calories that were previously thought that nuts had contained were just going undigested through the digestive tract. And they did this study, kind of gross, but of course needed to be done, where they looked at the residual calories in the stool of subjects after they ate whole nuts, and they found that a significant amount of these calories aren't even being digested because they're a whole food, and there are particles that go undigested and remain undigested through the GI tract. But then you take a food like nut butter, like almond butter, peanut butter, which is a processed food, right? It's basically pre-digested, and you're absorbing 100% of those calories. So by sticking to whole foods, your hunger is gonna automatically regulate itself. You're gonna digest probably a significant fewer amount of calories. Which is another reason why calorie counting I don't think is the best solution, because there's such a wide margin of error that calorie counting is subject to. And then there's, of course, what's called the thermic effect of feeding. And so certain foods have a higher thermic effect than others, meaning that your body is going to burn energy. It's going to burn off calories just digesting the food alone without you having to do anything other than eat it. And high protein foods are going to have the highest thermic effect, high protein whole foods. And the lowest thermic effect are going to come from, can you guess, ultra processed foods. And that's because whole foods burn about twice the calories just via digestion alone as ultra processed foods. And when it comes to macronutrient composition, ultra processed foods are primarily going to be, they're primarily constituted of carbs and fat, right? Carbs and fat are that sort of ultra palatable, it just lends a really great mouthfeel. It sends our dopamine, reward centers in the brain, like, it's like the 4th of July fireworks when we eat foods that combine usually sugar and fat. But people might know that fat has 9 calories per gram, carbohydrates and protein have 4 calories per gram. But actually, when you look at the thermic effect of these macronutrients, protein actually has 3 calories per gram because a third of the protein calories that you consume get burned off. So you're actually you're getting a bit of a metabolic advantage by prioritizing protein. And that's one of the dietary recommendations that I make in the Genius Life. I go sort of big on protein, which is something that, people in the fitness community have known the value of protein, but I think the population at large has kind of gotten a little bit confused about the value of protein because you hear things in the media all the time like we're eating too much protein, protein's not good for you, it's bad for your kidneys, none of which is actually true. And I think as a tool to satiate your hunger, protein is the most satiating macronutrient, and that caloric advantage that you get. I think that's one of the more practical recommendations that I make in terms of diet, that just by focusing on protein, prioritizing protein, most people will experience a spontaneous weight loss, especially if you're eating a low protein diet.
Yeah. It's so powerful, man. It's doing so many different things like the thermic effect, but also, it's this essential, it's a building block for communication in your body, your hormones, your neurotransmitters, so many benefits. And man, I'm so glad that you brought this up. This is something, again, I've been really talking about and thinking about and wanting to press in the popular culture because there's a lot of infighting with the carbs and fats, and protein sitting over here like, I get no respect. You know what I mean? And it's so important. It's such a powerful fuel. But I think that even going back a little bit and talking about the public perception, which is we're eating too much protein. And one of the reasons is like we see is processed meats, for example. You'll see the commercial with the KFC stacker.
Yeah.
Like you got the fried chicken bun, right? Each bun is a chicken, and then it's like I think it's like a burger or something in the middle with like bacon. I don't know. It's just like, But then we have just how folks have evolved. You know what I'm saying? And no matter which place we look in the blue zones all over the world, we're seeing a source of protein coming into play, but we're not talking about it enough. So I'm so glad you brought that up. But I want to go back and talk about that driving force when you talk about sugar and fat coming together. And so for me, it's like, and I know you grew up much the same way, it's like Eggos. Let go of my Eggo.
Yeah.
With some butter on there. You got the Pop-Tarts. You've got, all these different snack cakes and cookies and all these different things. When you combine these together, and you offer up a great tip in the book, and just like put a potato in the oven. So can you share that example?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can see the nature of hyperpalatability at work if you just do this little thought experiment. You can actually do it in your kitchen if you have a baked potato around. But if you were to bake a plain baked potato, you probably wouldn't be inclined to over-consume that potato. I mean, maybe you'll take a few mouthfuls, but it's really not going to be all that palatable. Interestingly enough, potatoes are pretty satiating. But they're just not. I think that the reason for that is that they're not very good. People don't really want to eat much more, after just a few forkfuls. But if you take that same baked potato and then you add fat to it, like let's say some grass-fed butter, which I've certainly indulged in a baked potato with grass-fed butter. You're adding fat to it, then you put some salt on it. Suddenly, that baked potato, the combination of those 3 elements makes it hyperpalatable. You're going to want to eat the whole thing. You might even go back for seconds. But the baked potato by itself, not all that palatable. The butter by itself, not all that. I mean, nobody's walking around eating sticks of butter, right?
Well,
maybe Dave Asprey.
Yeah.
The salt, And that's another thing, like that, a lot of people will say that sugar is addictive. I think that statement requires a little bit of investigation as well, because it's not like you see people mainlining pure sugar necessarily, but it's the combination of all those things that really trips up your brain's satiety checkpoints and hunger checkpoints, and it's at the root cause, I think, of the modern obesity epidemic, where by the year 2050, 1 in 2 adults are going to be obese, which is just insane to consider.
Crazy, man. Crazy. So your book, Genius Food's first book,
Yeah.
that's really the focus on food, nutrition. This is the genius life in this book. And you're traversing into other domains that help to create an overall healthy, sovereign human being. And one of the things you highlight, and just to talk a little bit about the food a little bit more, but it's not just the food, but also when you eat. And so you brought up some of the incredible data, and we're talking about, things like intermittent fasting, but just overall fasting in general. And so I want to talk about the mTOR. I want to talk a little bit about mTOR and how that plays into things when we're talking about fasting, longevity, and AMPK. I like AMPK.
Yeah, AMPK. Yeah, I mean, this is so cool. This is the first time I've been asked about these, actually. So basically, these are two of your body's chief nutrient sensors. So it's sort of like a thermostat that your body uses, for lack of a better term, that your body knows that your body uses to gauge nutrient status in the body, nutrient status, energy availability, things like that. For an organism, energy availability is a very pressing concern. Are you going to have enough energy available to navigate the world, to procure food, to procreate, and ultimately to survive? So your body has these nutrient sensors. AMPK is one of them. mTOR is another one of them. mTOR is primarily sensitive to dietary protein, and in particular, an amino acid called leucine. Leucine is not bad or good, but it is the most anabolic or growth promoting of the amino acids. So anybody who's ever been interested in bodybuilding or fitness knows that you need to get adequate leucine to grow muscle and to get strong. But mTOR activation, which occurs when we consume leucine, also has a dark side. Too much mTOR activation is thought to underlie the growth of tumors and cancer, things like that. AMPK is sort of a nutrient sensor that gauges the overall energy availability in the body. And how this works, it's pretty interesting. So the chief energy currency of cells is ATP. And when ATP gets used up, it basically becomes AMP, which is sort of like an energy depleted form of ATP. And when there's a lot of
I think of AMP, kinda.
AMP.
That's just how I think of
AMP,
it.
kinda. Yeah. But essentially, when too much AMP builds up in the cell, that's a sign that there's not enough energy, right? And so it activates AMP kinase, which is a pathway. It's a protein that basically sends a signal that there's not enough energy around. We need to create more energy. So it actually encourages the burning of fat, the burning of sugar. It's basically just like a land grab for energy when AMPK is activated. And it also helps to create new mitochondria. So it boosts insulin sensitivity. It is one of the pathways responsible for mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the creation of healthy new mitochondria. And the way to activate AMPK, which is thought to be this longevity pathway, also metformin, the diabetes drug metformin, activates AMPK. And this is one of the reasons why metformin is being looked at as a potential, fasting mimetic, a longevity promoting drug. I wouldn't recommend metformin because studies have shown that it can reduce the benefits associated with exercise. But nonetheless, so AMPK is this generally very beneficial thing, and it's thought to underlie the mechanism by which calorie restriction seems to be one of the most reliable ways to extend lifespan in smaller organisms. So you restrict calories, AMPK becomes activated because of that deficit of energy. You can also activate AMPK with high-intensity exercise, because what you're doing when you're doing high-intensity interval training, for example, like getting on that assault bike or swinging the battle ropes, or even with resistance training, you're creating a momentary energy crisis in your muscle cells that are like, oh my God, there's not enough energy around. If we don't generate enough energy, we're not going to survive, right? Yeah. And so AMPK activates, mTOR is suppressed, and so it's those are the two mechanisms by which exercise is and calorie restriction are meant to really be beneficial for the body. And these are also the proposed mechanisms by which intermittent fasting is supposed to work. So when we intermittent fast, for a time we're depriving the body of energy, we're depriving the body of protein, and so what you get is an upregulation of AMPK, a downregulation of mTOR, and both of these facts are thought to be longevity promoting. They're thought to reduce cancer incidence. Also, mTOR suppression is what drives, or one of the factors that drives autophagy, which is what I call like the KonMari method for biology. Marie Kondo, it's like she's all about tidying up. So it's how your cells actually tidy up. They clean out worn out dysfunctional proteins and organelles and things like that. And so when you calorie restrict, when you intermittent fast, when you do high intensity exercise, you're basically activating all of those wonderful pathways. And the beautiful thing about exercise and intermittent fasting and calorie restriction is that unlike drugs like, say, metformin, which I mentioned earlier, these pharmaceuticals really work on singular biological pathways or chemicals. Exercise, calorie restriction, intermittent fasting works the whole system out. And, it's so evolutionarily, it makes so much sense, and it's so comprehensive in terms of its effect on the body. That's why I think, these sort of lifestyle interventions should always be a first line of defense against the diseases of aging and even aging itself.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. I was really surprised to see such a big focus on what I'm about to ask you about, but it was pleasantly surprised. And it's the chapter on the vigor trigger.
Yeah.
Right? So, number one, can you share what that is?
Yeah.
And number two, why did you feel it was a necessity to like highlight this in depth like you did in this book?
Yeah. So the vigor trigger, it's what I call the chapter where I cover all things nature. And this isn't just, going out into the woods hippy dippy style. I talk about the value of getting sun on your skin, the value of exposing your body to variation in ambient temperature, just getting out into nature and being around greenery. There's just so many benefits associated with nature bathing. They're doing a lot of this research in Japan, but the benefits have become so obvious and so clear that now various universities and academic centers are studying how nature exposure can reduce cortisol, reduce anxiety, depression, things like that. But yeah, I mean, there's that saying, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And today we've built these environments around us that we've created to ultimately coddle us, whether it's the chronic climate control that we're exposed to, or the fact that the Environmental Working Group estimates that we spend 93% of our time indoors, out of the sun. There's just a lot that we've lost touch with. And so in that chapter, I talk about a few things. I talk about, for one, the value of getting vitamin D, of optimizing your vitamin D levels. So vitamin D is a steroid hormone that essentially controls the expression of 1,000 genes in the body, at least, which is 5% of the human genome. And it's important for keeping inflammation in check, keeping your blood pressure healthy, promoting arterial flexibility, which is the ability of your arteries to expand and contract in accordance with the needs of the organism as it navigates the environment. It's also being looked at now as a way of both preventing and treating autoimmunity. There's this really interesting study that found that children who were born during the summer months, meaning that women likely had higher, I think it was actually babies born in the winter months, meaning that women were spent most of their time pregnant in the summer months so that they had higher levels of vitamin D, ultimately ended up having lower risk of multiple sclerosis or MS. And vitamin D is actually the only vitamin supplement where there's really a strong body of evidence now saying that vitamin D can potentially help as a therapeutic tool for sufferers of MS.
Oh man, I've seen even MS, but I've also seen rickets. Like literally somebody comes in, their child into my office, rickets, just like they can walk over a tumbleweed, like their legs are so bowed. Vitamin D, man, I mean, legs are amazing today.
Yeah. Vitamin D is important. I mean, people think about it really in terms of bone health and being able to prevent rickets. But it's important for so many things. I mean, there are vitamin D receptors in cells in every organ of your body. It's important for reducing inflammation in the brain. In fact, there was a very interesting small study, needs to be replicated, but they found that the mere supplementation with 800 international units of vitamin D per day in patients with, I believe it was Alzheimer's disease or a mild form of Alzheimer's disease, it was a randomized placebo-controlled trial, found that vitamin D supplementation was able to essentially halt the progress of the disease for a time. So again, small study. I wouldn't, take that as gospel at this point. But yeah, I mean, we know that vitamin D is good for us.
Yeah. So what do we do? Do we go out and just swipe down the store shelves of vitamin D? What is the optimal way to get our levels right?
I think you want to spend more time in the sun. So when our skin is exposed to the UVB rays from the sun, our skin creates vitamin D, or a precursor to the active hormone in the body, and then it has to be converted in the kidneys and the liver to the active hormone form. What I think most people don't realize about vitamin D, which was surprising and something that I discovered while writing the book, is that the enzymes that activate vitamin D in the body require magnesium. Mm-hmm. And 50% of the population does not consume adequate magnesium. So what that means is that you might be supplementing with vitamin D, you might be spending time in the sun, maybe even spending too much time in the sun burning, and you might not actually see your vitamin D levels budge on labs until you start consuming more magnesium. So I'm actually a huge fan of magnesium. I talk about that in the book. One of the primary drivers of aging, it's been posited, is DNA damage. And DNA damage is also at the root cause of cancer. And we have an ability in our bodies to repair against DNA damage. But all of the DNA damage, all of the DNA repair enzymes require magnesium. Mm-hmm. So again, like magnesium is like this amazing thing. We require it to create ATP, which is energy. If you're not consuming adequate magnesium, you're not going to be generating the energy that your body is capable of generating. You're not going to be repairing against DNA damage to your full capacity, and you're also not going to be creating vitamin D effectively.
So now the big question, and I totally agree with you. Like, this is something we humans evolved getting access to sunlight. Now we're spending 93% of our time indoors on average, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And we've created this fear of the sun. And truthfully, sun can hurt you, but it's, for many people, you need more. You need more than the fear kind of construct has created. Now, with that said, what about folks you moved from New York, right?
Yeah.
You grew up in New York, right?
I grew up in New York City, yeah.
And then you, of course, you're out here now, it's Cali sunny, but what about folks in NYC? What about folks in New England? What about folks in, Halifax, Canada? What do we do in the winter months?
That's a good question. It's funny. I moved out here and somehow I still look like you're staring into a tube of Elmer's glue. Like I need to get that. I need to practice what I preach is what I'm starting to think. So vitamin D, I think the best way to get it is from the sun, because the sun, you're not just getting vitamin D, you're getting a boost in nitric oxide, which occurs when our skin is exposed to the UVA rays from the sun. You're also getting adequate bright light to anchor your body's circadian rhythm, which I talk a lot about in the book, and the value of that. But yeah, there obviously is variation in our capacity to synthesize vitamin D. If you're older, you need to spend more time in the sun compared to when you're younger. You become less efficient at creating vitamin D in advanced age compared to younger people. If you have a darker complexion, you need to spend more time in the sun. Melanin is nature's sunscreen, so even though people with darker skin color might actually look better as they age, they need to really be conscious of vitamin D and spending more time in the sun. People who are overweight actually need to spend more time in the sun than their thin counterparts, because vitamin D, like vitamin E, A, and K, is a fat-soluble vitamin. It gets sequestered by fat tissue. So if you've got some weight on you, you got to spend more time in the sun. That being said, you don't want to burn, but yeah, time in the sun I think is crucial. Now, because there's also seasonal variation, that's where I think eating foods that are high in vitamin D can come in to help get you to the next, time at which you can get out into the sun. And so fatty, oily fish, cold water fish, egg yolks, great source of vitamin D, a significant source of vitamin D through the diet. And then also we can store a little bit in our fat tissue as well.
Yeah. That's a little bit of an insurance. You can store some, so those months that you can get adequate sun exposure, you can store it up so you don't have to be neurotic. But at the same time, incorporating those foods, maybe some high quality supplementation for those that need it. It's such an important nutrient. Like you said, this is a steroid hormone.
Yeah.
But so with that said, also we want to do this as natural as possible. Let our body kind of figure it out and get sunlight. So what's the best way about getting the sunlight exposure? Just like arms being out in your shirt, going out for a walk, shirt off. There's some research with getting some sun on Laysac. It can help to boost testosterone.
I've heard that, yeah.
Now, what about, so are we saying, so like get some on your back?
Yeah.
What about the butthole tanning?
Oh, man,
Max?
I've seen that, yeah.
So many of our friends even taking the pictures, the butthole tanning.
I know. I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, one of the guys who really made it popular, I know him. He lives in West Hollywood. His name is Ra. I've had him on my podcast.
No way is his name Ra.
His name is Ra of Earth. And I've had him on my show. We talk all about butthole sunning. I forget which episode it is, but it's there. The Genius Life. And but yeah, it's a thing. You know what? There's a lot of people in the evidence-based camp that like will poo-poo, no pun intended, that whole practice. But you know what? Like, if you enjoy the way that it feels, do it. I mean, you're still going to be creating vitamin D down there. Is there any magical thing that's going to happen by exposing your butthole to the sun? I don't think so. I mean, the sun is a powerful disinfectant. So maybe, maybe there's some truth there that this ancient wisdom, they found that it was a good way to clean up somehow, with the sun. But, dude, I don't know. I think generally the more surface area you can expose to the sun, the better. Now, you're still, like, the sun can still photo age you. So if you're going to spend, an excessive amount of time in the sun, you might want to put some sunblock on your face. You might want to, if you're going on vacation and you think that you might end up burning, which is not good, sunblock. I talk all about chemical sunblocks in the book and how you want to avoid those. So if you are going to go for a sunblock, I always recommend like a zinc oxide, like a mineral-based sunscreen. And I'm also a huge fan of a supplement called astaxanthin, which is a marine carotenoid. It's found in wild salmon and crustaceans, and it actually acts like a sunscreen from the inside out. So I take astaxanthin every single day, but I also will kind of like double down if I know that I've got like a trip to the tropics coming up or something like that.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm a big fan. Krill is like the big source.
Krill's great.
For the astaxanthin. So, wow, that's great stuff. So we got vitamin D, and you also mentioned magnesium. So let's hit on just a couple of foods for people to target with magnesium. And also, what about supplementation?
Yeah. So foods that are high in magnesium, I always prefer getting my minerals from food, but magnesium is sort of an exception that I make. I'll supplement with magnesium. I take magnesium glycinate, which is magnesium bound to glycine. It's not going to upset your stomach. If you take too much magnesium citrate, which is a cheaper form of it, it might give you diarrhea because it draws water into the gut. So I'll take that. But generally, foods that are high in magnesium, you can't beat pumpkin seeds. They're a very high source, very rich source. Dark chocolate is actually a great source. Almonds are a wonderful source. And I just learned this today, actually, that Brazil nuts are also a fantastic source. And when you eat either of those four foods, you're getting with them a ton of other micronutrients. So I'm a huge fan of dark chocolate. It's great for the brain, great for the cardiovascular system. Almonds are rich in vitamin E, which is a wonderful protector molecule for the brain. Brazil nuts are rich in selenium, which is a great protector molecule for the brain as well. So you really can't go wrong. Magnesium is it's important. And again, half of the population doesn't consume adequate amounts of it. It's actually like it's like a longevity supplement in a way, I think.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. It's so funny that. And you just mentioned in food, when you're eating food, you're getting all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
And you can't help but have the realization that it probably helps absorption. It probably helps your body to use it more intelligently when it's packaged with these different phytonutrients that are coming along with the magnesium. You know what I mean? Versus the isolated thing, which this is the one thing too. In my practice, when people would come in, this was the one supplement that I kind of consistently got people to take in addition to the nutrition changes was magnesium. Just because it's such an important thing, man. And so I'm so glad that you brought it up and you highlighted in the book. But you also, when you were talking a little bit earlier about the butthole tanning, just to go back a little bit,
Yeah, let's go back.
you also mentioned sunscreen, right? Which is a bad transition there. But sunscreen is one of those sources potentially. I saw some research years ago. I haven't looked at it in a while. But finding that folks using certain sunscreens and certain compounds in sunscreens being carcinogens that lead to cancer. And you have a chapter in here focused on toxic world.
Yes.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are some of the things that we need to be aware of when we're dealing with this very new environment for our human genes to be exposed to?
Yeah, so that's a chapter where I try my best not to fearmonger. I just, and not to make alarmist claims, but I think it's very important for people to become aware of the different compounds that they are exposed to on a chronic basis that may be having a profound effect on their health without them even knowing it, or consenting to it. And so sunscreen is one of those things where, recent studies, very, very recent studies have been performed finding that when we slather our bodies with these chemical drugstore sunscreens in accordance with the instructions on the package, that they are actually able to enter circulation at a concentration far higher than was previously thought. And the levels at which they're able to reach in the body is even above the FDA's threshold for toxicological concern. And these compounds include avobenzone, oxybenzone. Oxybenzone is a potential endocrine disruptor, meaning it can mess with your system of hormones that guide everything from your risk for certain diseases, fat storage, brain function, and if you're younger, development. So that's a chapter where I really go deep into the science of endocrine disruption, and I talk about some of the more common proposed endocrine disruptors. But what's so tricky about anything that's going to artificially mess with your hormones is that, at different points along the age spectrum, they could either have undesirable effects, or they can have, and temporary effects, or they can have potentially lifelong effects. So I just want people to think more, critically the next time they take these drugstore chemicals and they slather their children on, they slather them on their children. Oxybenzone, as I mentioned, may be a potent endocrine disruptor. And also, these compounds actually are able to transform into other potentially even more dangerous compounds when exposed to chemicals in pool water. This was recently revealed. So it's just it's a mad world that we're living in, and I don't like to give these compounds the benefit of the doubt. The stance that I take in the book is that we should consider them guilty until proven innocent, and they really haven't been proven innocent. A lot of the time, these chemicals will be sort of foisted into the, onto the human population, allowed to enter the marketplace before appropriate testing has been done. I really don't know why it was now that we found out about this. The fact that these chemicals are to such a high concentration able to enter circulation, and what the downstream effects of that are going to be. We just don't know.
Right.
So people should just definitely be more skeptical. I talk a lot about plastic-related compounds like BPA and phthalates. Phthalates are anytime you'll see a soft plastic, like a disposable water bottle. They're also used in fragrances. So synthetic fragrances are made using phthalates. And then we have BPA, which is used to make hard plastic. So you'll see BPA typically in the lining of cans. You'll see it in reusable water bottles. Consumers have become aware of BPA at this point, and so it's led to a lot of manufacturers removing BPA and replacing BPA.
Where did BPA start?
Oh man, BPA started. This is an interesting story. So BPA actually, it originally was developed as a pharmaceutical, because BPA possesses profound estrogenic-like activity in the body. It's known as a xenoestrogen. So in the body, what it does is it will mimic estrogen, or it'll affect how estrogen functions, which is the primary female sex hormone, but men have estrogen, to a much smaller degree in their bodies as well. And so it was actually designed to be a medicine back in the day. I mean, this was in, I believe, the 1930s, was when the estrogenic properties of BPA were first identified in London by a professor named Edward Dodds, I think his name was. And what happened was ultimately they discovered a different compound called diethylstilbestrol, or DES. And DES actually had way higher estrogenic potential compared to BPA. And so DES actually got approved for use as a drug. They started using it to give to women to alleviate symptoms of menopause and premenstrual syndrome. They were just injecting it into women, like millions of women. They also started to give it to livestock to increase milk production, to promote growth. And what like is so often the case, maybe not often, but is so frequently the case, what they ended up ultimately finding was that girls born to women who were injected with DES ended up having all kinds of vaginal cancers, cervical cancer, and things like that. And so DES was basically just a much more powerful form of BPA. But BPA and DES, they're chemically related. BPA was never actually approved for use as a pharmaceutical, but instead they realized that it could be used to make hard plastics. And this was at a time when it was like the 50s, when the American dream really was starting to become crystallized in the minds of consumers, and suddenly we could fill our homes with plastics, plastic furniture, plastic cutlery. It just seemed like this miracle compound, right? You could do anything with it. It was heat resistant, it was sanitary, it was safe, in air quotes. And that's I use air quotes to say safe because for the longest time, BPA was thought to be inert. It was just it could be used to create plastic, but that it was going to ultimately stay there. And what we now know is that BPA is able to leach into the foods and beverages that are stored into compounds made with BPA, and also chemically similar compounds, newer compounds like BPS and BPF that are being used to replace BPA, but there's no reason to suspect that they're going to be any safer than BPA. And BPA also, because it's used in things like furniture and electronics and the like, actually is able to slough off and create dust that we then inhale. So it's literally everywhere. It's one of these chemicals that you'll just find in drinking water all over the United States. 99% or 97% of human beings have measurable amounts of BPA in their blood. It's one of these everywhere chemicals. Yeah. A major source of BPA is actually store register receipts. So if you go to a store and you get a receipt and it's a thermally sensitive paper, you can always tell. I mean, they have a certain feel to them. They feel kind of dusty, but you can write on them with your fingernail. Those papers are coated with BPA. And actually, what's interesting is that if you use another study has found that if you use a hand sanitizer before touching these receipts, it dramatically increases your exposure to BPA. The hand sanitizer basically makes your skin a lot more sensitive and permeable to environmental toxins.
Yeah, it's a solvent.
Yeah. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. And so just think about all the people who are doing that, right? All the cash register clerks, they're like already making minimum wage, stuck in jobs that are probably not what they had envisioned for themselves as children, right? But then they're touching these compounds that are just keeping them, not at their most optimal. We'll just say that. And then we get handed these receipts, and then we hold the hands of our children. And children, as I mentioned, are particularly sensitive to these compounds because these are endocrine disruptors.
Yeah. First of all, who's still getting receipts? Like they ask you, do you want a receipt, or would you like to email the receipt? It's just silly, but it's these micro exposures, like you're saying. And I love that you outline so many micro exposures that we're not aware of, and it creates this huge conglomeration.
Burden,
Yeah.
Burden of toxicity, yeah. And to be clear, the doses at which we're exposed to, I mean, they are having effects in the body. There have been a number of studies that have found that they can alter insulin responses. They can, they act like estrogen. And the thing that I also talk about in that chapter, which I think people need to know, is that what you'll often hear from the evidence-based, and I use air quotes, camp, people who are just really, not open-minded to the idea that these compounds can have deleterious effects on human health, they'll often say that the dose makes the poison. The dose we're getting is very low. It's been, thought to be safe, but the dose makes the poison, I think, works for the vast majority of toxins, right? But what makes endocrine disruptors like BPA and phthalates particularly treacherous is that they don't necessarily always follow that dose makes the poison paradigm. There's what researchers refer to as low-dose toxicity or non-monotonicity. So basically, the dose makes the poison implies that with increasing dose, any compound is going to become increasingly toxic, increasingly dangerous, and that nothing is really implicitly toxic. It's all about the dose. You drink enough water too fast, somehow suddenly water becomes toxic. The problem is that these endocrine disruptors, it's suspected that they don't actually follow that nice and convenient linear curve, that they can actually have an effect in the body, a completely different effect than they would have had at a high dose, at a very low dose. And that's one of the reasons why I think these compounds have been able to kind of escape political and scientific scrutiny, because they're just so hard to study and predict, and they might have different effects on different people at different times in their lives.
Yeah, that's so important to understand. It's all case dependent, person dependent, even time of your life dependent.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
That's just macronutrients. Forget about that, and think about the 25,000 molecules in food that are phytochemicals that come from plants, and actually now are found in meat that eat plants. From data from Fred Provenza and Stephen Van Willette at Duke, it's pretty compelling when you get wild animals or when you have grass-finished beef that's eating a wide variety, not just like one grass and one pasture, but a wide variety of plants. They actually increase the levels of these beneficial phytochemicals in the meat.